It's been a while since I've done any Pantheon content. But like most things, we have our ups, downs, and lull periods, and this is the same with MMO production. But today, I've turned my eyes and ears back to a game that I'm looking forward to, that being Pantheon: Rise of the Fallen. The June 2022, for those in future, developer roundtable was a treat, with so many little tidbits, beans, and other pieces of quirky information that the developers over at Visionary Realms have provided us. So today, I thought I'd provide you with a few personal highlights from the stream, along with a few of my own opinions on the matter. This isn't intending to be a replacement for the main developer roundtable, so I highly advise you that if you've not watched it, you should go and have a look at it. The link will be down in the description below, as some of the elements I will touch on will require some context from the stream. Overall, it shouldn't require much other than appreciation for the game itself. Without further ado, I'll be breaking this video down into the following chapters: Overground and standard dungeons, interconnectivity between dungeons and zones, points of no return, keeping dungeons fresh and content balanced, and finally providing my final thoughts on the matter. Again, there is so much to listen to in the developer roundtable that I highly recommend that you go back and watch them if you haven't done so, even if it is simply for the purpose of exploring and understanding the design process and the mentality behind that process. But with that said, let's jump into the first topic. Our first section today might be simple, but it actually has a purpose: the definition between Overground and standard dungeons. Simply put, the difference that was highlighted is that there is a fundamental difference between the two, but simply using the word underground is a misnomer for the regular or standard dungeons. Despite its size, for instance, Black Crow's Keep is considered one of these standard dungeons despite it being well above ground. The takeaway from this element is that overground dungeons will be designed to have a limited, smaller version of the dungeon experience, but is by no means something to shirk away from, whilst standard dungeons will appear in the same vein as the Halnir Cave dungeon, with a larger, more explorative experience. There might also be a lore reason behind overground dungeons that may require their existence, such as the Orcish settlement of Hangor in Avendir's Pass, wherein the context of the dungeon and the plot setting is the more important detail rather than simply attaining the loot there. All in all, the difference is minute, but at the same time adds to the level of depth in the game by ensuring that the experiences, no matter how small in scope, have their own unique feel and the additions to the worlds around them, rather than the standard feel of a modern MMO, where it can almost write off these dungeons as trivial or unremarkable. But moving on from the previous segment, we find ourselves discussing the interconnectivity between dungeons, zones, and the wider world as a whole. It is all being confirmed in the roundtable the intentions to have dungeons where in certain areas are not only connected to potentially other dungeons in itself, but able to traverse the zone lines or boundaries and enable players to access otherwise inaccessible areas of the same zone via different in and out points. An honourable mention is made to the Seven Locked Door, with the not so subtle name being called out in the dev roundtable and being confirmed to be a dungeon where one continues to progress further and further into its currently unknown depth, travelling from one dungeon section to another in this interconnected way. Developing an interconnected world via dungeons these days sounds like a bit of a lost art, and the idea of travelling from a dungeon into a deeper dungeon is reminiscent of older titles in the genre. Not only will the idea of players delving deep be a rewarding feature, but the ability to traverse zones and explore hidden areas that were previously inaccessible is no doubt a way to push the missing elements of exploration that have been vacant for some of the more mainstream MMORPGs for some time. With all this in mind, it honestly feels like a great idea, and I personally can't wait to see it in action. Whether it be traversing into the deep dark or the hidden nooks and crannies that reward players for the experience of further content and ultimately the progression of exploration itself in its purest form. But going past the realms of interconnectivity was the concept of points of no return inside of dungeons and how likely they'll be a feature. In its simplest form, the idea behind these situations are areas wherein travelling across a threshold will result in the players only able to be going forward and not going back into previous areas. As highlighted in the DRT itself, was that the mechanic is not unwanted in the eyes of the developers, but there would need to be some limit on the form of the mechanic used, and to ensure that the idea didn't get stale. It is easy to see how such an idea could become stale if abused, After all, do you really want to go through 2 or 3 points of supposed no return in order to simply get back to an area you desire to do so, or to progress further into a dungeon? Especially with the previous topic we discussed, there is a good indication that these areas will be used. They fit well with the idea of keeping dungeon exploration interesting even after an initial delve, and ensure that connectivity between areas doesn't become trivial in these deep dungeon areas. Delving into the depths and providing players with an ultimatum really sits well with the development of a more natural sandbox dungeon rather than a typical theme park on wheels experience that many MMORPGs today subscribe to. Coupled with the potential dungeon designs, exploration, and other elements as previously discussed, it becomes easy to see that the designs are taking us back to a previous age, where the decisions of a party mattered on which way they went, and ensure that no decision is taken lightly whilst exploring. But what then about keeping the dungeon experience fresh? After all, after running a dungeon 3, 4, or even 20 times, there has to be an inherent draw to keep players returning to do the content in question, other than a sheer love for the game or the area itself. Well, in VR's mindset, one of the ideas behind this is the idea of fractures, limited time events which may change the atmosphere or climate of a dungeon for a time that will provide increases in difficulty and potentially new experiences in the dungeon itself. Coupled with the fact that these dungeons may have certain elements that are not available during an initial exploration, potentially linked to the ideas of getting different items or different skills to traverse the dungeon, also leads to replayability, as all players will have a reason to return to explore these previously hidden areas. Further to this, the elements of the perception on keeper systems that are being thrown into the works, alongside the fact that mobs may drop lore on an infrequent basis, allowing people who are lore crazy like myself to piece out fragments of the area over the course of many trips, is a sort of wonderful little tidbit for us. All in all, the intention to keep the game fresh and the content repeatable, especially when the game going and intending to go back to the roots of the MMO genre, is nothing short of interesting in its development and something that I hope to see in future. And finally, we come to my final thoughts on the matter. The DRT gave me a renewed sense of enthusiasm for the game. Not that it had been waning, but given that dungeons are the integral part of an MMO experience, it's always been an element for concern about where the direction would go. Especially in a day and age where many might have only experienced a linear, on-tracks experience in the form of a theme park MMO, it might be interesting to see what their experiences are like now that they get to chew on the designs that we are currently seeing might be happening in Pantheon. My own personal experience is that I can't wait for this element of dungeon exploration, if not to capture the essence of the world that's been missing in many MMOs for some time. In this sense, by stepping into a dungeon in the world of Terminus, we will not be simply getting another rail track through that dungeon, but one where we are encouraged to get dirty, rummage around, and ultimately get lost in the immersion and feeling of a living area of the world itself. There is ultimately a lot in the DRT that I have not covered, and with good reason, because ultimately I feel that you should go away and review and look at the developer roundtable in your own time to gauge and take in full detail what Visionary Realms are trying to produce here. To finish off, I think this quote from Chris Jopper Perkins from the DRT summarizes the feelings and experiences that they are trying to get with dungeons, which is something more refreshing and engaging than ones that we currently expect from a current day MMO. The quote is a little long, but I feel it's better to be heard in full than cut for context.
There's so much that I could say about the kind of MMOs that exist right now. They don't feel like MMORPGs because they are too lobby based and too teleport centric. And so
100% agree.
There has been lost this sense of the feeling of actually going to and arriving at a place for the first time and it having multitudes of mysteries and secrets and layers of accessibility and layers of unlocking and layers of prestige that you can develop as a player when you're able to come back and open up more of the world to yourself based on your progress, based on your investment of time and the things that you've accumulated and achieved for yourself. There's just an entire economy of like social player driven behavior that can exist when the game is not just a lobby-driven, interface experience where you're actually in the world, existing, exploring, so on.
Thank you for watching, and take care.